While Europe burned and Marines stormed Pacific beaches, another war was being fought. A war defined not by famous generals or decisive battles, but by distance, terrain, and endurance. In the China-Burma-India Theater, the jungle itself became the enemy. Malaria struck down 14 soldiers for every one wounded in combat. Pilots flew blind through storms that could freeze a plane solid in minutes. Mountains swallowed entire aircraft, their wreckage still undiscovered today. This was the forgotten theater, and by the time you finish this video, you'll understand why some of history's most dangerous battles leave the smallest footprints in our memory. The China-Burma-India Theater didn't begin with Pearl Harbor. It began in 1937 when Japan invaded China. For 4 brutal years before America entered the war, Chinese nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek fought a grinding defensive campaign. By 1941, Japan controlled China's entire coastline and every major port. Millions of Chinese had died. Millions more had become refugees. China's last lifeline to the outside world was a single road, the Burma Road. Built in 1937 and 1938 by over 200,000 laborers, this 717-mile route snaked from the Burmese rail station at Lashio through mountain passes and river valleys to Kunming in southwest China. Supplies shipped to the port of Rangoon traveled by rail to Lashio, then by truck over roads carved from cliffsides where one wrong turn meant death. For the Allies, keeping China in the war wasn't about sentiment. It was cold strategic calculation. Chinese forces tied down over 1 million Japanese troops that would otherwise flow to the Pacific or threaten India. If China collapsed, those forces would be freed. The war would become exponentially harder. In early 1942, everything changed. Japanese forces swept through Burma in a lightning campaign. By May, they controlled Rangoon and had seized Lashio. The Burma Road was cut. China was completely isolated. The Allied response was desperate and unprecedented. If they couldn't supply China by land or sea, they would do it by air, over the most dangerous terrain on Earth.
Pilots gave it a deceptively simple name, the Hump, the eastern end of the Himalayan mountain range, stretching from airfields in India's Assam Valley to Chinese bases around Kunming, 500 miles. The most dangerous airlift route in military history. The Hump wasn't a single mountain, it was a series of ridges, some reaching 15,000 feet, separated by river gorges deeper than the Grand Canyon. Pilots had to clear peaks while carrying full cargo loads in aircraft barely capable of reaching those altitudes. The weather made the terrain worse. Monsoons brought zero visibility for months. Thunderstorms spawned turbulence violent enough to tear wings from airframes. Ice formed so rapidly on propellers and wings that engines seized mid-flight. Winds reached 100 miles per hour, blowing aircraft miles off course. And the pilots? Many had just left flight school. They navigated with primitive instruments, unreliable maps, and no radio beacons. They flew by dead reckoning, calculating position based on time and compass heading. In storms where you couldn't see your own wingtips, this meant educated guessing. The operation began in April 1942 with modified DC-3s and fewer than 30 aircraft. It was described as temporary, a stopgap until ground forces could retake Burma. It lasted 3.5 years. By 1944, the Air Transport Command operated with 142 aircraft and 5 full crews per plane. Eventually, over 700 aircraft, supported by 84,000 personnel, flew continuous missions. At peak operations, a plane crossed the Hump every 2 minutes, delivering up to 10,000 tons of supplies monthly. The losses were staggering. Conservative estimates place aircraft losses between 590 and 700 planes. At least 1,314 aircrew and passengers were killed. Another 345 were declared missing. Some sources suggest over 1,200 men died on the Hump, roughly 1/3 of all pilots who flew it. One historian calculated that every 340 tons delivered cost the life of a pilot. Over 500 aircraft remain missing, their wreckage scattered across remote valleys and peaks. For decades after the war, villagers reported finding crash sites, bones still in the cockpits. This wasn't combat, this was logistics, and it was as deadly as any battlefield. While pilots fought the sky, infantry fought the earth. Burma was, and remains, one of the most inhospitable combat environments in military history. Dense jungle vegetation so thick you couldn't see 10 feet. Mountain ranges covered in rainforest. Rivers that flooded without warning. Monsoon rains that turned trails into swamps and made tactical movement almost impossible for months.
In 1943, the British 14th Army recorded an illness rate of 1,200 cases per 1,000 men, meaning every soldier was sick at least once, most multiple times. At peak, over 5,000 malaria cases were diagnosed daily. Dysentery, typhus, jungle rot, and infections soldiers had never heard of became routine. General William Slim, commander of the 14th Army, later wrote that disease was fought not by doctors, but by officers who enforced discipline. Taking anti-malarial medication became mandatory. Officers who failed to enforce it were relieved of command. Slim only had to fire 3 before the message spread. For every Allied soldier evacuated due to combat wounds, 14 were evacuated for disease. Many never fully recovered. The long-term health effects followed veterans for the rest of their lives. The ground campaign centered on reopening supply routes to China. This meant driving Japanese forces from northern Burma, hundreds of miles of some of the worst terrain soldiers had ever encountered. British and Indian forces conducted long-range penetration raids behind Japanese lines. The Chindits, named after a mythical Burmese creature, marched hundreds of miles through enemy territory, supplied only by airdrop. Their first operation in 1943 suffered 27% casualties, 818 men killed, wounded, or missing, from 3,000. Those who returned were, in the words of one report, racked with disease and in dreadful physical condition. The only American ground combat unit in the theater was officially designated the 5307th Composite Unit. History remembers them as Merrill's Marauders. Approximately 3,000 volunteers, some from stockades promised pardons if they survived, trained for jungle warfare and deployed to Burma in February 1944. Their mission? Conduct long-range penetration operations to support Chinese forces driving south through northern Burma. They marched over 800 miles through jungle and mountains. In 5 months of operations, they fought in 5 major and 30 minor engagements. They defeated veteran Japanese units through surprise, marksmanship, and small unit tactics. But disease destroyed them. By the time they captured the airfield at Myitkyina in May 1944, a strategic objective that shortened Hump flights considerably, the unit was disintegrating. Final casualty figures show 272 killed in action, 955 wounded, and 980 evacuated for illness. Some died later from cerebral malaria, dysentery, and typhus. When Myitkyina town finally fell in August, only about 200 of the original 2,750 Marauders were still fit for duty. The unit was disbanded a week later. Of those who entered Burma, only 2 survived who had never been hospitalized with wounds or major illness. Listen to how one Hump pilot described it. A time of urgent effort, sometimes terror, at other times utter boredom, and occasionally unmatched exhilaration. Terror because weather could kill you faster than the enemy. Hump pilots faced what they called a no-weather proclamation, meaning no matter how bad conditions were, the Hump was never officially closed to flights. Pilots flew when they could barely see past their propellers. At high altitude without proper oxygen, confusion set in. Even General Henry Hap Arnold,
The only person ever to hold the rank of General of the Air Force got lost due to oxygen deprivation while flying the Hump.
Those who crashed or bailed out faced choices that haunt the imagination. Some landed in freezing mountain wilderness with no possibility of rescue. Search aircraft faced the same dangers. Others came down in enemy territory, where Japanese patrols captured, tortured, and executed American pilots. Part of Hump pilot training included instruction on using your last bullet on yourself. For infantry, the psychological toll was different but equally brutal. Isolation defined the experience. You were thousands of miles from home, fighting in a theater the newspapers barely mentioned, in conditions that seemed designed to break human beings. A Chindit soldier wrote of finding a refugee murdered on the road, her throat cut, her child's skull crushed. These images stayed with men decades later. Watching comrades die from disease was uniquely demoralizing. Combat deaths soldiers understood, but malaria, dysentery, infections from minor cuts that became gangrenous in the humidity, these felt preventable, senseless. During the siege at Mpumga, one marauder described watching a fellow soldier die a few feet away when Japanese artillery fire sent tree splinters and shrapnel through him. The psychological strain of being surrounded for 10 days under constant mortar fire, watching the wounded suffer because evacuation was impossible, this broke even experienced soldiers. Operational fatigue became epidemic. Tunner's flight surgeon reported that half the men flying the Hump suffered from it. Pilots pushed themselves to accumulate flight hours quickly so they could go home, which increased accident rates. The desire to survive became its own danger. Between 1942 and 1945, the Hump airlift delivered 650,000 tons of cargo to China. In July 1945, the final full month of operations, 71,042 tons were delivered, a monthly tonnage higher than entire nations' imports. Over 33,000 people were transported in both directions. The operation became proof that massive airlift was possible under the worst conditions imaginable. On the ground, Allied forces achieved their core objective. In January 1945, Chinese forces advancing from India linked up with troops moving from Yunnan province. The land route to China was restored. The Lido Road, built by American engineers through impossible terrain at a cost of more than 1 soldier per mile, connected with the old Burma Road. China remained in the war. Japanese forces that might have reinforced the Pacific remained tied down on the Asian mainland. From a strategic perspective, the CBI theater accomplished its mission, but the costs were extraordinary. Beyond the 1,314 confirmed dead and 345 missing from the Hump, ground forces suffered thousands more casualties from combat and disease combined. Burmese civilian deaths during the Japanese occupation totaled 250,000. The construction of the Burma-Thailand Railway alone killed an estimated 70,000 Asian laborers under horrific conditions. The long-term health consequences followed survivors for life: chronic malaria with its recurring fevers, amoebic dysentery that damaged digestive systems permanently, typhus complications, physical exhaustion that aged men a decade in a year. Many veterans of the CBI theater received inadequate recognition. Their service happened in a theater overshadowed by larger campaigns, fighting battles the public never heard about. So why did the China-Burma-India Theater fade from popular memory? Start with geography. The CBI was literally on the other side of the world from American population centers. News took longer to arrive. Fewer war correspondents were assigned there. The stories that did emerge competed with dramatic narratives from D-Day, island-hopping campaigns, and the liberation of concentration camps. The theater's command structure was Byzantine. British, American, and Chinese forces operated under different chains of command, with different strategic priorities. There was no clear American commander until late in the war.
General Stilwell, the most prominent American officer, was eventually recalled in 1944 after clashing with Chinese leadership. This complexity didn't translate into simple narratives. Americans wanted clear stories of good versus evil, decisive battles, heroic victories. The CBI offered logistical miracles, political infighting, and grinding attrition warfare. The CBI had no equivalent of D-Day, no single dramatic moment when everything changed, no Iwo Jima flag raising, no easily photographed beaches storming with landing craft. Instead, it had pilots disappearing into storms, engineers dying of disease while building roads no one at home had heard of, small unit actions in villages Americans couldn't pronounce. The theater also received fewer resources. Of 12.3 million Americans under arms at the war's peak, only about 250,000, roughly 2%, served in the CBI. This was by design. Allied strategy prioritized defeating Germany first, then focusing on the Pacific Island campaign as the route to Japan. The CBI became an economy of force theater, doing just enough to keep China in the war and Japanese forces occupied, but never enough to achieve dramatic breakthroughs.
After the war, this secondary status became self-reinforcing. Historians focused on campaigns with clearer outcomes and better documentation. Filmmakers told stories with obvious dramatic arcs. The complexity and ambiguity of the CBI theater made it harder to package into popular narratives, and so it faded, not immediately, but gradually, into footnotes, into the margins of history. In Charlotte, North Carolina, there's a memorial dedicated to CBI veterans. Most people walk past it without understanding what it represents. It remembers pilots who flew over the Himalayas knowing they had a 1 in 3 chance of dying. It honors infantry who fought in conditions where disease was more dangerous than the enemy. It commemorates engineers who built roads mile by mile, while Japanese snipers and dysentery killed them in equal measure. 500 aircraft are still out there, somewhere in the mountains and jungles, undiscovered, unmarked, like the theater itself, present, significant, but invisible to those who don't know where to look. The China-Burma-India Theater reminds us that history isn't just written by the victors. It's written by proximity and drama, by simplicity and sentiment. The most dangerous battles sometimes leave the smallest footprints, but they still mattered. The men who fought them still bled, and their stories still deserve to be told. This is Untold War Chronicles. If this story moved you, leave a comment telling us which other forgotten front of World War II you'd like us to explore. And subscribe, because there are more stories like this, stories that deserve to come out of the shadows.